A man does not fall in love because he meets the right person. He falls in love when something inside him collapses. This is the truth you are willing to say. Before love enters, the armor must crack. Before devotion appears, the illusion of self-sufficiency must fail. Most men are trained to survive without intimacy. They build identities around control, achievement, and emotional distance. Love threatens these structures. It asks him to risk confusion, vulnerability, and inner chaos. So unless something happens first, unless a hidden psychological door opens, love remains unreachable. What opens that door is not desire, attraction, or even admiration. It is confrontation with his own inner emptiness. When a man encounters a woman who reflects the parts of himself he has buried, his fear, tenderness, longing, and unresolved wounds, something destabilizing occurs. He does not simply want her, he recognizes her, and that recognition is unsettling. This is why men often fall in love after loss, failure, or emotional disorientation. When the ego is shaken, the heart becomes audible. Love enters not as pleasure, but as meaning. It feels dangerous because it threatens the identity he used to survive. True love does not confirm who he thinks he is. It dismantles him. It forces him to integrate what he rejected within himself. He is not drawn to the woman alone, but to what she awakens, an inner dialogue long silenced. Until a man is willing to face himself, his shadow, his unmet needs, his unexpressed emotions, he may desire many, but he will not love. Love requires an inner readiness, not external perfection. And when that readiness arrives, love is no longer a choice. It becomes inevitable. Men do not fall in love through attraction alone, but through inner psychological rupture, because attraction by itself is safe. It allows distance. It lets desire exist without requiring surrender. A man can admire, pursue, and even obsess without ever risking the core of who he believes himself to be. Attraction operates on the surface of identity, while love threatens its foundations. For love to emerge, something deeper must fracture the internal structure that once kept him emotionally contained. From an early stage, many men learn to organize their inner world around control. Emotions are managed, delayed, or suppressed in the service of stability and self-respect. Vulnerability becomes something private, even dangerous. This inner discipline creates strength, but it also creates separation. As long as this structure remains intact, attraction can be enjoyed without consequence. He can want without needing. He can desire without being changed. Love, however, demands transformation, and transformation begins with rupture. Psychological rupture occurs when the strategies that once kept a man whole no longer work. This can arise through failure, loss, exhaustion, or an encounter that exposes emotional blind spots he didn't know existed. Suddenly, the familiar inner narrative of independence feels hollow. The man may experience restlessness, confusion, or an unnameable dissatisfaction. It is in this destabilized state that love becomes possible, because the defenses that kept intimacy at bay begin to weaken. When a man meets someone during or after this rupture, the connection feels different from attraction. It is not simply exciting, it is unsettling. The other person seems to see through him, touching areas he has avoided. She reflects not only what he wants, but what he lacks. Her presence awakens emotions he cannot easily categorize: tenderness, fear, longing, and a sense of exposure. This is not infatuation, it is recognition. Something inside him responds because something inside him has already broken open. This is why love often feels threatening rather than comforting at first. It destabilizes identity. The man senses that if he allows this connection to deepen, he will no longer be able to maintain the emotional distance that once defined him. He will have to integrate parts of himself he kept separate: need and strength, vulnerability and dignity, dependence and autonomy. Attraction asks for pursuit. Love asks for integration. Without rupture, love feels unnecessary. With rupture, love feels inevitable. The man is no longer seeking completion through control, but through connection. He is no longer trying to protect an image, but to restore inner coherence. Love becomes the space where fragmented parts of the self can reunite. This is why timing matters more than chemistry. Two people may meet at the wrong psychological moment and feel nothing beyond surface desire. At another moment, when inner certainty has collapsed, the same encounter could alter a life. Love does not arrive when a man is full, but when he is cracked enough to feel what was once sealed away. Emotional self-sufficiency blocks love until it collapses, because it is built as a survival strategy rather than a pathway to intimacy. It teaches a person, especially a man, to rely only on his own strengths, to manage emotions privately, and to avoid the risk of needing anyone too deeply. On the surface, this appears admirable. It looks like maturity, independence, and control. But beneath it lies a quiet isolation, where connection is limited to what can be safely managed. This self-sufficiency forms early. It grows from moments where emotional needs were unmet, dismissed, or misunderstood. Instead of reaching outward and being disappointed, the individual learns to turn inward and close the door. Over time, this becomes an identity. He becomes the one who does not ask, does not lean, does not break. Attraction can exist comfortably within this framework because attraction does not require exposure. It can be pursued on one's own terms, at a distance that preserves autonomy. Love, however, cannot exist where emotional independence is absolute. Love requires permeability. It asks for emotional exchange, for the willingness to be affected, for the courage to let another person matter enough to influence one's inner world. Emotional self-sufficiency resists this because it equates dependence with weakness. To need someone feels like a regression, a loss of dignity, a threat to self-respect. As long as this belief remains intact, love is filtered, controlled, and ultimately prevented. The collapse of emotional self-sufficiency does not happen gently. It occurs when the inner structure that once provided stability begins to fail. This may be triggered by exhaustion, loneliness that can no longer be ignored, or a life event that reveals the limits of self-reliance. Suddenly, the person realizes that strength alone does not soothe emptiness, and control does not resolve longing. The tools that once ensured survival now feel insufficient. In this collapse, discomfort rises. There is confusion, vulnerability, and often resistance. The individual may feel exposed without knowing why. But this moment is also an opening. Without the rigid barrier of emotional independence, there is space for connection to enter. Love becomes possible not because the person is weaker, but because he is more honest. He recognizes that self-sufficiency was never wholeness, it was protection. When love enters after this collapse, it feels different. It is not about being completed by another, but about allowing another to participate in one's inner life. The fear of dependence transforms into trust in mutual presence. Strength is no longer measured by emotional isolation, but by the capacity to remain open without losing oneself. Until emotional self-sufficiency collapses, love remains an idea rather than an experience. Once it falls, love becomes less about control and more about shared reality, where two inner worlds can meet without armor. Love begins when a woman mirrors a man's suppressed inner world, because what is hidden within him is what most urgently seeks recognition. Many men move through life with large portions of their emotional reality buried beneath function and responsibility. Sensitivity, fear, longing, creativity, and unresolved grief are often pushed aside in order to maintain stability and direction. These aspects do not disappear, they wait. And when they are reflected back through another person, something profound is stirred. This mirroring does not occur through effort or performance. It happens unconsciously. A woman may speak, move, listen, or respond in ways that resonate with parts of him he rarely acknowledges. He feels seen without knowing exactly what has been seen. Her presence evokes emotions he cannot easily trace to a memory or a moment. The familiarity feels unsettling because it bypasses logic and touches something older and deeper than attraction. What he experiences is not simply interest in her, but recognition of himself. She becomes a living reflection of qualities he once disowned or left undeveloped. Her warmth may awaken his buried tenderness. Her emotional depth may stir his unexpressed vulnerability. Even her flaws can echo parts of his own shadow, inviting him into a confrontation he has long avoided. This is why such connections feel intense and inexplicable. They activate inner material that has been dormant. Attraction excites the senses, but mirroring activates the psyche. The man feels pulled inward rather than outward. He begins to reflect, question, and feel more deeply. He may become unusually introspective, protective, or emotionally responsive without understanding why. This shift marks the beginning of love, not as possession, but as inner movement. Something inside him is being called into awareness. This process can be disorienting because it destabilizes the identity he has constructed. The mirrored inner world challenges the narrative of emotional control and self-sufficiency. He is no longer simply acting, he is responding. The connection demands authenticity rather than performance. He senses that maintaining emotional distance would mean denying a part of himself that has finally found expression. Love emerges here not because the woman completes him, but because she reveals him. Through her, he encounters emotions he avoided, needs he dismissed, and capacities for connection he underestimated. The bond feels meaningful because it facilitates inner integration. He begins to reclaim what was split off in order to survive. This is why love cannot be forced or manufactured. It arises naturally when the conditions for inner recognition are met. When a man feels mirrored at a deep psychological level, love becomes less about the other person and more about the reunion of his fragmented inner life. Loss, failure, or confusion often precede deep love because they dismantle the inner certainty that once kept the heart guarded. When life is predictable and identity feels intact, love remains optional, even inconvenient. A person can choose connection or avoid it without consequence. But when something collapses, when a role is lost, a dream fails, or direction dissolves, the emotional landscape changes. What once felt solid becomes fragile, and the need for meaning intensifies. Loss strips away what was familiar. It may be the loss of a relationship, a sense of purpose, status, or even the image one held of oneself. In its absence, silence grows. Distractions lose their power. The individual is forced inward, where unresolved emotions and unmet needs surface. This inward turn is uncomfortable, yet necessary. Without the external structure to lean on, the heart begins to speak more clearly. Failure carries a similar effect. It confronts the ego with its limitations. The strategies that once ensured confidence no longer guarantee success. This humbling experience fractures the illusion of control. In that fracture, emotional depth expands. The person becomes more receptive, not because they are weaker, but because certainty has been replaced with openness. Failure teaches what achievement never could, that worth cannot be fully sustained through performance alone. Fusion is perhaps the most subtle precursor to love. It arises when life no longer makes sense in the way it once did. The future feels uncertain and identity feels unfinished. In this state, rigid expectations loosen. The person becomes curious, attentive, and sensitive to emotional signals that were previously ignored. Confusion dissolves the inner script, making space for something unplanned to enter. When love appears after such experiences, it feels different from love born of comfort. It carries weight and meaning. The connection does not merely distract from pain, it speaks to it. The other person becomes associated with clarity, not because they provide answers, but because their presence feels grounding. Love becomes a stabilizing force in a disoriented inner world. This is why deep love rarely arises during periods of emotional certainty. Certainty protects identity but resists transformation. Loss, failure, and confusion soften the boundaries of the self. They create psychological openness, where intimacy can take root. The individual is no longer relating from a place of defense, but from a place of honesty. In these moments, love is not sought, it is recognized. It feels inevitable because the inner conditions have changed. The heart, having been emptied of false assurances, becomes capable of genuine attachment. Love enters not as rescue, but as resonance, a response to an inner readiness shaped by hardship and uncertainty. True love dismantles identity before it rebuilds meaning, because identity is often constructed for survival, not for truth. Most people move through life wearing a version of themselves, shaped by expectation, necessity, and protection. Roles are adopted, behaviors repeated, and emotional limits enforced to maintain stability. This identity feels solid because it has worked. It has kept pain manageable and life organized. But it is also incomplete, built around avoidance as much as expression. When true love enters, it does not simply add comfort to this structure. It challenges it. Love introduces a mirror that reflects inconsistencies between who one believes they are and who they actually feel themselves to be. The presence of another person who matters deeply disrupts emotional routines. Reactions become stronger, vulnerabilities surface, and defenses fail without warning. The familiar self no longer functions smoothly. This dismantling often feels like loss rather than gain. The individual may experience confusion, insecurity, or a sense of inner chaos. Old coping mechanisms no longer provide reassurance. The need to appear strong, independent, or unaffected becomes difficult to sustain. Love demands responsiveness, not performance. It asks for emotional presence where distance once offered safety. As identity loosens, unresolved parts of the self emerge. Past wounds, unmet needs, and suppressed desires rise into awareness. This can feel threatening because it destabilizes the narrative that once defined self-worth. The person may question who they are outside of roles, achievements, or emotional control. Love exposes the gap between the constructed self and the authentic self. Yet this dismantling is not destruction for its own sake. It is preparation. As the old identity weakens, space is created for meaning to emerge. Meaning is not imposed, it is discovered through shared experience, mutual recognition, and emotional truth. The individual begins to rebuild not around defense, but around connection. In this rebuilding, love becomes transformative. Values shift. Priorities realign. Strength is redefined as emotional availability rather than control. The self that emerges is more integrated, capable of holding contradiction without fragmentation. Identity becomes fluid rather than rigid, grounded in authenticity rather than image. True love, then, is not about preserving who one was, but about becoming who one is. It dismantles what is false or incomplete, not to leave emptiness, but to allow a deeper coherence to form. Meaning arises from this process, rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and shared presence, where identity no longer needs armor to exist. A man loves only when he is ready to confront himself, because love is not an escape from the inner world, but an entry into it. As long as he avoids looking inward, love remains something external, an experience to pursue, manage, or control. He may desire, attach, or even commit, yet remain emotionally untouched. Love requires more than participation. It requires self-exposure. Until a man is willing to face his own inner reality, love cannot fully take hold. Self-confrontation is not comfortable. It means acknowledging fear instead of disguising it as indifference. It means recognizing unmet needs rather than denying them as weakness. Many men build identities around competence and control, learning early that emotional clarity must be earned, not revealed. This creates a distance from the self. Feelings are filtered, softened, or ignored to preserve stability. Love threatens this balance because it amplifies what has been muted. When a man begins to confront himself, the first experience is often disorientation. The familiar narratives no longer explain his reactions. He may feel drawn to someone in ways that challenge his self-image. Emotional responses surface without permission. He is forced to ask questions he previously avoided: why he withdraws, why closeness feels dangerous, why certain wounds remain unhealed. This internal inquiry marks the threshold of love. Love emerges not because he finds the right person, but because he becomes capable of presence. Confronting the self creates honesty. He can no longer project unmet desires onto others or expect relationships to compensate for inner absence. Instead, he recognizes his responsibility for his emotional life. This responsibility deepens his capacity to care. He listens more closely, reacts more truthfully, and engages with greater depth. Without self-confrontation, relationships remain transactional. Affection is exchanged, but inner worlds remain separate. With self-confrontation, love becomes relational rather than strategic. The man is no longer trying to maintain an image or protect an identity. He allows himself to be seen not as an ideal, but as a human being in process. This readiness transforms love into a space of growth rather than validation. He does not love to be completed or rescued, but to be met. The relationship becomes a mirror that continues the work of self-awareness rather than replacing it. In this way, love is sustained not by certainty, but by courage. A man loves only when he accepts the discomfort of knowing himself. In facing his inner contradictions, he becomes capable of genuine attachment. Love is no longer something he reaches for. It is something he inhabits, grounded in self-recognition and emotional truth. So this is the truth that waits beneath desire, beneath timing, beneath chance. Love is not something a man stumbles into by accident, nor something he conquers through effort. It arrives when he is willing to stand unguarded before his own inner life, when he no longer runs from discomfort, no longer hides behind strength, no longer confuses control with wholeness. In that moment, love stops being a mystery outside him and becomes a responsibility within him. He does not love because someone finally proves worthy of his heart. He loves because he is finally brave enough to meet himself, and in doing so allow another to truly meet him as well.